Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final edition of Toronto's Most Notorious. I have had a wonderful time over the last few months getting to share these stories with you, and I'm incredibly excited to share the last set of them with you as well. And yeah, at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about the new series that's coming in the fall about Toronto's most scandalous stories. Today, though, for our final Toronto's Most Notorious lecture, we're going to be talking specifically about bootleggers and smugglers, since there are a ton of stories about uh, sort of our shadow lurking entrepreneurs, let's say, who take advantage of some of the city's sort of geography and culture. When you go back to the city's early days as an urban settlement, as Sergio said in the introduction, in the land acknowledgement, this is a place where the First Nations and their ancestors had already been living for thousands and thousands of years by the time the first British settlers showed up in the late 1700s. But to the British, at least, this was to them sort of the edge of the known world. When Toronto was founded as the town of York, it was very much a frontier town and would remain that way for a long time to come. This is one of the very earliest known photographs of our city. There's a whole set of them taken in the 1850s to sort of show off how far Toronto had come in the 60 plus years since it had been founded as a settlement. But looking back at these photos, the thing that most strikes you is how much it kind of looks like what you might expect to see from a town in the Wild West. It was now a city of something like 40,000 people, but it's still very much a place with muddy roads and wooden sidewalks. Almost all the buildings are capped about 3 stories tall. And it really was sort of the last big city of its size as you moved west across what's now Canada. So the big cities further west of here, places like Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, Vancouver, Victoria, none of those cities had been founded yet, which made Toronto kind of the edge of the Canadian colonies in a lot of ways. And the culture of this place reflected that. Toronto in the middle of the 1800s was a very rough and tumble town and a very hard drinking place. They say that in the early 1800s, the average American drank 3 times as much as they drink today, and Canadians were said to be even drunker than that. So as you can imagine, Toronto was a pretty rowdy place. With only tens of thousands of people living here, we already had 125 taverns. There were times that they had hundreds of beer shops on top of that. At its height, there was something like 100 taverns, sorry, 1 tavern for every 100 people living here, and more taverns than streets. So you can imagine what kind of town this place must have been like. And the fact that the people who are captured in this early set of photos, well, we know some of them must have been up to no good. And I can't believe it's taken me this long in the Toronto's Most Notorious series to bring up this statistic, but it's one of my absolute favorites in all of Toronto history. It's that the year after these photos were taken, in 1857, on average in Toronto, 1 out of every 9 people was arrested just in that 1 year alone. It was a city that had a notorious reputation and was this pretty rough, drunken, frontier-style town. But in the decades to come, there'd be a lot of pushback against that as well. As it grew into sort of a big, booming Victorian metropolis, people were looking to change the city's reputation and to crack down on what they saw as vice and sin. And the guy who became sort of the figurehead for that movement for a while was this guy, William Holmes Howland. He ran for mayor in 1886 and would serve 2 terms. And his campaign slogan, the promise he made to the people of Toronto, became a nickname for our city that people still use to this day. It was William Holmes Howland who coined the phrase Toronto the Good, which was this promise that Toronto would be what to him seemed like a more moral place. In fact, he created a whole new department of the Toronto police force with that goal in mind. It's how the Toronto Police Morality Squad was born, which was in place to kind of enforce this very conservative vision of what Toronto the Good should be. In practice, the Morality Squad was cracking down on anything people in power thought of as immoral, which included drinking and gambling and sex work. Morality Squad was horrifically homophobic as well, and they'd be around for a long time to come. The last mention I've seen of them being active from the Toronto newspapers from the year 2000. They were involved in the bathhouse raids and plenty of other notorious moments in the city's history. And it all starts here in the late 1800s as some of the conservative forces in the city are trying to, in their minds, clean things up. But even as the city lost its feeling of being a frontier town, it was still, in many ways, and really, I think quite literally, a border town as well. Our docks were docks that were deeply connected with the cities on the other side of Lake Ontario. It's easy to forget because you can't see it looking over the horizon if you're standing on ground level in Toronto, but just there, just across the horizon. In fact, I think some of the water you can see when you're looking out across Lake Ontario from the East End in particular, that's American water. In fact, from the spot I'm sitting right here today, from the 14th floor in the Junction, I can on a clear day see the towers of Niagara Falls and see American territory. And it's easy to forget, but the United States is right there. We have an international border that basically borders our city. When you look at a map of Lake Ontario, this is the boundaries of Toronto today. The United States, the water border is just right there. In fact, if you're standing on the tip of the Leslie Spit, the distance to the United States is about the exact same distance as you are from Steeles and from Richmond Hill when you're standing in that spot. I checked on Google Maps, it's about 21.6 kilometers in each direction. So the Toronto is still today, in many ways, a border town. And there are lots of landmarks around our city that are reminders of the people who have taken advantage of that fact. One of my favorites is out by the Scarborough Bluffs. It's called Gates Gully, not far from Bluffers Park, sort of a ravine that cuts its way up through the Scarborough Bluffs, one of the few places that you can walk between the lake and the top of the bluffs. And it's said to have spent a lot of its history as a trail for smugglers who would bring things across the border, bring them to the foot of the bluffs, and then use the gully to ferry their illegal goods up into the city itself. Out on the other end of the city in Etobicoke, what's now the Polish consulate, this photo from the Toronto Public Library digital collection is the best photo I could find of it, and has led me to want to learn a lot about this hunger strike from the 1980s as well. But what's now the consulate started its life as McGuinness House, the home of Lawrence McGuinness, who was a notorious bootlegger in the days of Prohibition, who built this mansion on the money he made sneaking booze across the border into the United States. And out on the islands, well, they were even closer to the United States than most of the city, closer to that border. And they've always been a place where people can push the boundaries of what's allowed in Toronto, since it's a place that's physically removed from the rest of the city. It's where lots of duels were fought in our early days. Some of those will definitely come up during the Toronto's most scandalous series. It's where people pushed the boundaries of booze as well. In fact, it's already come up in our lecture series before. The lightkeeper, the first lightkeeper out there on the island at the Gibraltar Point Lighthouse, J.P. Radelmuller, was brewing his own bootleg beer in the German style he'd learned from his youth in Bavaria, which had made him very popular with the soldiers of Fort York and led to his murder. That when he cut a couple of those soldiers off when they had too much to drink, they ended up getting their revenge by pushing them off the top of the lighthouse and launching one of Toronto's most famous ghost stories in the process. And the islands have kind of served that function ever since. And lots of people in Toronto who wanted to skirt the law have done it out there on the other side of the harbor. One of my favorite stories I stumbled across, I think sometime last year, was about something in the late 1800s happening out at Hanlon's Point on Sundays in particular. Now in Toronto, this very conservative place, this Toronto the Good, all sorts of stuff was banned on Sundays. Through various times in Toronto history, you weren't allowed to play sports or take a streetcar or go tobogganing. I'm sure many of you remember you weren't allowed to go shopping on a Sunday in Toronto until 1992. And you weren't allowed to sell cigars either. But there were some enterprising fellows out at Hanlon's Point who found a technicality in the law that they thought was a way to get around getting in trouble for it, which is that if you headed out to Hanlon's Point on a Sunday, you'd find the cigar sellers out there, but they wouldn't be selling cigars. Instead, they'd be selling matches. And as a free gift to you when you bought some matches, they would also give you some cigars. So you weren't technically buying the cigars at all. They hoped to get around this Sunday law, the Lord's Day Act, doing a little cigar bootlegging, you might argue, on the side. In fact, one of the most famous island dwellers of all time was himself a bootlegger. Hanlon's Point is named after the Hanlon family. The father lived out there fishing the waters around the point, and took his son out with him often. The whole family lived out there, which is why it's Hanlon's Point. And they say that's why Ned Hanlon got so good at rowing, that he grew up on the island, headed out fishing with his father, and every day he'd have to row across Toronto Harbor to the mainland to attend school, and then row back again at the end of the day to return home. And that experience would help make him the greatest rower in the world in the late 1800s. But before that, he was very much trying to make his living out there on the island itself. His family had opened a hotel in the 1870s, Hotel Hanlon, which started off looking like this. It was actually their home that was converted into a hotel originally, I believe, and would get expanded much bigger and fancier than this in the decades to come. They'd add an amusement park next door, roller coasters and spinning rides. There'd be a baseball stadium out there too, where Babe Ruth hit his first professional home run. But in the early 1870s, before all of that, it seems Ned Hanlon, who inherited the hotel and was left trying to make a living off it, well, to make ends meet, he thought he had to be able to sell some booze at the restaurant, at the hotel, and I think outside it, there on the boardwalk, maybe as well. The problem with this is that Ned Hanlon didn't have a license to sell that booze, which meant that Ned Hanlon was literally a bootlegger selling booze without permission. And we know this because he was arrested for it and put on trial. Ned Hanlon found himself on the mainland, I think at the Adelaide Street Courthouse, which is still there today. It's the Toroni Restaurant, just around the corner from St. James Cathedral, where you still find the old jail cells in the basement on your way to the bathroom if you need a break while eating dinner there. And Ned Hanlon had a series of court dates on these bootlegging charges, on selling alcohol without a license, and was found guilty. The case, as the Globe reported, was proved. And even worse than that, it was also proved that Hanlon had bribed one of the witnesses in the case, had paid the expenses of this witness to get out of town so that they wouldn't testify against him, a fact that was also uncovered and left Hanlon having to pay an even bigger fine than he would have had to pay for the bootlegging. In fact, it seems like it might even have been a matter of principle with him because he paid the witness more money than he'd have to pay in a fine for bootlegging to get them out of town. And that means that in August 1876, Ned Hanlon's name was appearing in the newspaper for pretty notorious reasons. In fact, this whole episode would lead to what seems to be a myth, an even more dramatic version of the tale that's become part of the lore of Ned Hanlon as he went on to become this famous rower. According to this version, there was a day that month in August of 1876 that Ned Hanlon was hanging out here at the Toronto Rowing Club, kind of next door to his hotel, when someone told him that the authorities were on to him, that they were coming for him, that the police, maybe the morality squad itself, oh, actually, it can't have been them. It would have been the precursor to the morality squad since they were still a decade away. Well, that those cops were closing in and they were going to show up at the rowing club to have him arrested for this bootlegging, at which point Ned Hanlon decided to make his escape, that he slipped out the back door of the rowing club, and knowing the island well as he did, he was able to slip through the closing noose, managed to find himself one of the skiffs, one of the little boats that were all over the place at Hanlon's Point, and use that skiff to make his escape. Ned Hanlon, the incredible rower, rowed as fast as he could out deep into the lake, leaving those police officers behind who watched helplessly as he rowed up to a steamboat, climbed up a rope ladder on board, and took it all the way across the border into the United States, where he would be untouchable, since bootlegging wasn't part of the extradition treaty between Canada and the US. In this version of the story, he actually just keeps on going once he hits American soil. That's where the story returns to documented historical reality, because we know that just later the same month that Hanlon was being put on trial for bootlegging in Toronto, he also rowed his first big international race. He had won the Toronto Bay race already and helped make his reputation. But in 1876, Philadelphia was home to an enormous regatta, the Centennial Regatta, celebrating 100 years of American independence, bringing rowers together from all over the world. And Ned Hanlon from Toronto became the winner of the big single rower race. I guess maybe single oared. I'm not sure what the technical rowing term is, but it made Ned Hanlon a hero. This is from, I believe, the front page of the Globe newspaper. People in Toronto were over the moon that a Torontonian had won the famous Centennial Regatta. On top of that, he'd even done it in the final race against another Torontonian. The top two were both Canadians. And so when Ned Hanlon returned home from the Centennial Regatta, Toronto was there to celebrate. As he pulled into Toronto Bay and pulled up to the Yonge Street Wharf at the foot of Yonge, there was a huge crowd of Torontonians who had come to welcome him home. Thousands and thousands of people, a big marching band who played, I believe it's Handel's hymn, "See the Conquering Hero Comes." They'd even gotten together, had people donate bars of, barrels of oil and tar, put it all out on Hanlon's Point and set it alight in an enormous bonfire. And when Hanlon reached dry land in Toronto, that was just the beginning of that evening's celebration. As dusk settled on the city, thousands more people were lining the streets of downtown to welcome him home with a victory parade. Many of them brought torches that they lit as soon as it got dark enough for them to be of use. The newspaper writes these stirring descriptions of the flames reflected in all the windows of the downtown shops and buildings. Some of them brought oars of their own to wave in the air in celebration of their hero. And Ned Hanlon was paraded past them on what must surely be one of the stranger parade floats our city has ever seen. They got a fire engine rescue wagon and then stuck a boat on top of it and then loaded Ned Hanlon awkwardly up into the boat, teetering atop of this fire wagon, and then paraded him through the streets on that, with people cheering, the marching band playing, and the city in absolute elation about this big victory. As the Globe said, it was a splendid demonstration and that the whole city was astir. The climax came at Allen Gardens, which had an older version of the pavilion that's there today. Today we have that wonderful greenhouse, which was actually built to replace this bigger pavilion that burned down, I think in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s. I'm not sure the date. And back then, it was one of the premier event spaces in the city. It's where Mark Twain and Oscar Wilde spoke when they were in town. And that night, it was all about Ned Hanlon. People could pay admission, 10 cents each, to come inside and listen to the famous rower speak, and other local dignitaries welcome him home, including the mayor himself. Angus Morrison presented Ned Hanlon with a fancy watch that they'd collected money for from ordinary Torontonians to give him as a gift. And Angus Morrison welcomed him with a speech declaring that Ned Hanlon was honorable, kind, and good-natured. The same Ned Hanlon who'd been on trial for bootlegging just a month ago, just days before he headed to Philadelphia to win that race. Suddenly, those bootlegging charges were forgotten, and Ned Hanlon, the notorious bootlegger, had become Ned Hanlon, the Canadian hero. He'd go on to become one of the most famous Canadians of the age. So good at rowing that he'd leave opponents in the dust, would troll them by getting big leads and then stopping, blowing kisses to the crowd until his opponents caught up, and then he just took off again. This race here, they set up floating grandstands in Toronto Harbor. So many people wanted to see him, and so many business interests wanted to make money off tickets. The crowds were so thick that someone actually fell off the roof of a railway grain elevator on the Esplanade trying to get a view, fell to their death. But because Ned Hanlon won the race that day, it was still celebrated as a huge victory. He was so famous. One of my favorite Ned Hanlon facts is that when he toured Australia, they named a town in his honor after his own hometown, so that there's a Toronto, Australia today, because they loved Ned Hanlon so much, they named that town after our city, since this is where Ned Hanlon was from. And Ned Hanlon was far from the only famous bootlegger or smuggler who was known well beyond that notorious reputation. The second of the three big stories I want to tell you today is connected, strangely enough, to the story of Charles Lindbergh, who in the 1920s became the first to fly across the Atlantic Ocean in his Spirit of St. Louis, one of the most famous stories of the 1920s. It's a landmark in aviation history. In a weird roundabout way, has a Toronto connection. Because Lindbergh wasn't the only one trying to do it. In fact, he wasn't the only one trying to do it the day he did it. There was competition. A big prize had been offered for the first person who was able to pull off a New York to Paris flight. Lindbergh would do it, but this guy was trying to do it too. I like to think they took this photo of him after he got the news that Lindbergh had pulled it off. He does not look happy, Charles A. Levine. He'd started off living kind of in poverty. His dad was a junk dealer. He followed in his footsteps selling scrap, but he'd ended up making a fortune during the First World War, helping sort of to recycle armaments during that horrifying conflict. And it had made him a millionaire. And it was through this race across the Atlantic in the air that he made his fame beyond that. He would call himself, in fact, the millionaire stowaway, because he was about to become the first passenger in an airplane to cross the Atlantic Ocean. At the very same time that Charles Lindbergh was trying to do it, Charles A. Levine had this plane, which in fact nearly became the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles Lindbergh had approached him, knowing this plane, known as the Columbia, existed, offered to buy it off him and rename it the Spirit of St. Louis. Charles Levine said he'd be happy to sell, but that he would get to pick who flew it and who the crew was. Lindbergh didn't agree to those terms and stormed out, bought another plane and called it the Spirit of St. Louis instead, named after his hometown, while Levine called his the Columbia, and he hired another pilot to pilot it. In fact, he had a couple of them, but decided in the end he wanted to be on board himself, which is how he ended up losing the race. Because the co-pilot he kicked off in order to take his place sued, basically got an injunction to keep him from flying until the court case was solved, which gave Charles Lindbergh the chance he needed. The court case was eventually thrown out hours after Charles Lindbergh took off. Charles Levine's plane was sitting there at the same airport in its hangar as Lindbergh and the Spirit of St. Louis took off. And when Lindbergh landed, the very next day, Levine announced that he would be trying to launch an even bigger flight, that his pilot would take his plane, the Columbia, to try to cash in on another prize, flying between New York and Berlin, an even further, more incredible journey, and that there would be a secret passenger, a mysterious second aviator, which turned out to be Levine himself. They say that as the plane took off, he had lied to his wife about what he was going to do. He said he was just going to putter around the runway a bit and get a feel for it. And that as she watched the plane instead actually take off on the runway and head over the ocean toward Berlin, that some say she fainted, others that she cried out. He had actually written his will secretly just before leaving, and would have a dramatic crossing of the Atlantic. They actually buzzed right over the ship Lindbergh was taking back to the United States at the same time. And they ended up, as the Daily Star reported, smashing the record for the longest nonstop flight. They ended up having to make an emergency landing when they ran out of fuel after a fight between Levine and his pilot over which direction Berlin was in. But they'd still managed a very impressive feat that made Levine, for a while, seemingly a household name, reported on the front page of papers even in Toronto. This was another one of the big stories of the jazz age, of the roaring 1920s. But of course, just a couple of years after these flights, that age came to a crashing end with the big stock market crash of 1929, and it completely upended Levine's life. He had made some bad investments that the stock market wiped out. That means the Levine spent the rest of his life living a life of poverty and of crime. But this old junk dealer was now engaging in counterfeiting, in grand larceny. He was brought on charges of labor law violations, of not following worker compensation rules, arrested for forgery. He was once found having attempted to kill himself, unconscious in his kitchen with 6 gas ranges on his stove open. But the thing he was most infamous for after his flight across the Atlantic was the story of his smuggling. And that's where Toronto comes in, because his smuggling operation centered on 2 train stations, the first of which was Union Station in Toronto, which had only opened a few years before. And it was there, as the trains prepared to depart Toronto, that some of them were being loaded with some suspicious packages. They must have weighed an absolute ton as they were being loaded onto those trains to then leave Toronto behind and head across the border into the United States. We talked a couple of these lectures ago about how the railroads were able to bring people, including criminals, across the border very quickly. And the many have exploited that connection, especially sort of in the golden age of the railroads. But in the 1880s, there were even bankers in the United States who realized that they could steal the money from their bank at the end of a workday, board an evening train for Toronto or Montreal, and be in Canada before the bank opened in the morning and everyone realized all the money was gone. They say at least 2,000 people, these criminals they called bootleggers, sort of exploited this loophole, and that since those crimes weren't covered by the extradition treaty between Canada and the US, they couldn't be held responsible for their crimes. But people could use them to transport stuff as well as people, which is exactly what Charles Levine was doing. Those trains from Toronto would arrive at Grand Central Station, where those heavy loads were brought back off the trains, and Levine had railway porters help him load them into his car. When it was discovered what was inside these packages, some of the railway porters would actually find themselves on trial. They would testify against him, including about the fact that he didn't tip them very well, sometimes not at all, which might have been a fatal mistake, since they do seem to have been willing to testify against him in court about the fact that these packages were filled with tons and tons of tungsten powder. 5,000 pounds of them, maybe in all, according to some news articles, have been ferried across the border on these trains out of Union Station into the United States. He was buying them at a discount in Canada and then bring them to the United States, where they could be sold for stuff like, I think they're used in the filaments of light bulbs, things like that. And that Levine, having lost his money in the stock market crash, was now trying to make it back by smuggling tungsten into the United States. And so suddenly his name was back in the papers again, arrested on charges of being a smuggler, put on trial, the porters from the railway testifying against him. A couple of his alleged accomplices in Toronto were arrested as well, though from what I can tell, they were both released. Certainly at least one of them was released and the charges dropped, while Levine himself was convicted of the crime. He had to pay a huge fine and spend, I think it was something like 18 months or 2 years in prison. His wife, who he'd already lied to about flying across the Atlantic, decided the time had come to divorce him, and his life after that fell apart even more than it had already. He would, in fact, never be able to pay the fines that he owed for all his various crimes. In the 1950s, he was investigated even by the FBI. You can find their file on him online. The FBI was, at this point, just trying to figure out whether they could get him to pay all this money he owed in fines for his criminal activities. And they discovered that by this point, he simply couldn't. The millionaire stowaway would spend the rest of his life basically destitute. He would, in fact, need to rely on the charity of his old connections to keep paying his bills, living a life very much on the margins ever since. According to some sources, the main fine that he was unable to pay was from the one thing he did that seems to have been unequivocally good. Because there was one moment where Charles A. Levine used his smuggling experience to try to do some good. This was during the Second World War, when he headed to the southern United States border at Laredo, Texas, the border with Mexico, and helped smuggle a human being across that border, setting him up with fake documents and a fake identity, with ID cards from someone who I believe was dead, in order to smuggle this person into the United States, because this person was a Jewish refugee who had escaped the Nazi concentration camps in Europe, had been denied an American visa, which some say would have been essentially a death sentence. He was at risk of being sent back into Nazi Germany. And so Charles A. Levine, who was himself Jewish as well, helped Edgar Shinnick get these fake documents to get him across the border into the United States in order to save his life. From what I can tell, it did work, even though they were caught. Shinnick was apparently released, allowed to live free, while it was Levine who ended up paying the legal costs for it. Was sent, I think, to jail again and forced to pay a big fine, a fine in the end he was never actually able to pay, since by this point he was already living basically in poverty. And so when he died eventually in 1991, having lived an incredibly dramatic and colorful life, he was at the time mostly remembered for that transatlantic flight, for becoming the first passenger ever to fly across an ocean. But after that, while he was largely forgotten, those who do remember Levine, well, many of them seem to remember him not for those notorious years of smuggling, but instead remember him as a hero. Now, there's one last story I want to tell you, because in all these talks of bootlegging and smuggling, we haven't got into the golden era of bootlegging in Toronto, which of course comes in the early 1900s. If we rewind even further back than that, to the days of William Holmes Howland and Toronto the Good, I mentioned that one of the things he really wanted to crack down on was drinking. In fact, that's a large part of what got him elected. He was a big leader of the temperance movement, of the idea of cracking down on booze and alcohol and liquor licenses, a movement that blamed it for many of society's real problems. And so when he got in power, having beaten a brewer to win the mayoral race, that's what he set about trying to do. And while he didn't get very far in his time in office, his replacements in the years to come would very much live up to that idea of Toronto the Good. In the 1860s, so a few years after those early photos were taken, there were 300 taverns in Toronto, one for every 150 Torontonians. But half a century later, as the city had exploded, the number of liquor licenses had actually been dramatically cut. So that by 1911, the lead up to the First World War, there were only 110 taverns where there had once been 300. And since the population was much bigger now than it had been, Instead of one for every 150, it was now one for every 3,500 Torontonians. And that was really just the beginning. It was in 1916, during the First World War, that Prohibition arrived. This is the Premier of Ontario, William Hearst, pouring out some booze himself. He was a huge temperance and prohibition supporter, and Prohibition really launched the golden age for bootlegging and smuggling in our city. The first arrest was made at the old Union Station. This is the second of the three that we've had. Stood sort of just to the west of where the current Union Station stands. Again, these gateways, docks and wharves and railway stations are often, of course, the places where bootlegging and smuggling is going on. And so in the early days of Prohibition in Ontario, the Toronto police made an arrest, I think, right here on the platform of the old Union Station. They found a Russian Canadian getting off a train, I think from Montreal, who turned out to have a couple of bulging pockets. And when they looked at what was in them, they found one had a bottle of booze, a bottle of liquor, and the other had a bottle of beer. Now, that wasn't a huge infraction, but the police were anxious and excited to be able to lay some Prohibition charges on him. So they made the arrest and then searched the rest of his belongings, which included a suitcase that when they opened, they found was filled with tins of booze. The tins had actually been custom made so that they'd use every square centimeter of available space within the suitcase, be able to carry the greatest amount of booze they possibly could. And this was the first big coup for the police in the Prohibition age. But it wouldn't be an easy task. Prohibition led to a flourishing of the bootlegging and smuggling underworld. And while the official taverns were shut down, speakeasies and their sort of dive bar cousins, blind pigs, sprang up in their place. Speakeasies were kind of the upper class version. Blind pigs are my new favorite. They say the name comes from a guy in Chicago who tried to do the same kind of thing those cigar salesmen were doing at Hanlon's Point. That instead of selling alcohol, this farmer or farm owner, I guess, in Chicago, would sell people tickets to see his blind pig, like literally a barnyard animal who couldn't see. And then when you bought a ticket to see the blind pig, he would give you some booze as a free gift to get around the law, so that the dive bar versions of speakeasies became known as blind pigs. And all through Prohibition in Toronto, they were flourishing. And it made the criminals in the Toronto underworld quite a lot of money, especially this guy, Rocco Perry, who became known as the king of the bootleggers. There have been multiple books written about him. One from the 1980s called The King of the Mob, I believe, James Dubrow. There's a more recent one by Trevor Cole, all about him as well. He's a fascinating figure to read about. He'd been born into poverty in Italy. His father was a goat herder, but left Italy as a young man, I think maybe even a teenager, to sail across the ocean and start a new life in North America. Eventually settled in Toronto, in the neighborhood where many newcomers were settling at the time. The neighborhood that had a reputation for being a notorious slum, thanks to the predatory landlords who were taking advantage of new arrivals in Toronto. But was also one of the city's first big thriving multicultural neighborhoods in a lot of ways, a vibrant place. I'm actually going to give a walking tour in a couple of weeks about the ward, between the ward, where Nathan Phillips Square is now, to Kensington Market, and some of these early roots of Toronto multiculturalism. And it was there, in this neighborhood, where generations of new arrivals, from freedom seekers who left on the Underground Railroad, to Irish refugees from the famine of the Great Hunger, and then waves after that. Jewish, Italian, eventually became the city's first Chinatown. And Rocco Perry, he lived on a house somewhere here on Chestnut Street. Could even be one of these, for all I know. He rented a room from a family whose landlady, the mom in this family, was a woman named Bessie Starkman. And she and Rocco Perry got along very well. So well, in fact, that they began having an affair that ended with Bessie Starkman leaving her family behind to start a new life with Rocco Perry, a life of crime. They eventually set themselves up in Hamilton, which is where they really got their empire going. They had their fingers in all sorts of illegal activities in these early years. Bessie ran a brothel in Hamilton. She was very much kind of the nuts and bolts thinker and organizer behind the operation, and said to be a pretty cruel, cold-hearted woman as well. Well, Rocco Perry was the more gregarious, sort of public-facing face of this enterprise. Even though he gave it sort of a friendly veneer, there were people dying at a suspicious rate around Bessie and Rocco right from the beginning. I think a murder at a New Year's party, a shooting here, a stabbing there. In fact, the first time Rocco seems to have really appeared in the local papers is when his wife died by suicide. And I say wife because Bessie Starkman wasn't even his wife. He married another woman after meeting Bessie Starkman, Olive Rutledge. I think he even started a family with her in Niagara, right up until the point where Olive got sick of being neglected in favor of Rocco's true love and threw herself out the window of an office building in Hamilton. As I say, they had their fingers in all sorts of operations. A lot of their money in the early years came from gambling. Toronto was very much part of their territory. In this era, in fact, even a little later, Ernest Hemingway, who lived in Toronto for a while, writing for The Star, claimed that Toronto was the most hard gambling town, heavily gambling town on the continent. He figured people were placing 10,000 bets on horse races every day. And pretty much every one of those bets, a cut of it, was going into the pockets of Rocco Perry and Bessie Starkman. But their empire really took off with the arrival of Prohibition. Now, Rocco Perry, up until this point, had pretended to be a gregarious salesman for the Superior Macaroni Company. But when Prohibition arrived, he actually ended up dropping that facade, even in public. Now, Prohibition was a bit complicated in Ontario. The rules changed over time, so I thought I'd give you a few bullet points to make sense of it. There were times when booze was just basically completely outlawed, but also lots of times, including when it was first introduced, when there were giant loopholes. So for instance, you could actually still make alcohol in Ontario. You just weren't allowed to sell it directly to people in Ontario. So the huge distillery that's now the distillery district, for instance, Goodrum and Warts, they were allowed to keep making more whiskey as they did at their height than any other distillery on earth. They just weren't allowed to sell it to people in Toronto or in Ontario. So a lot of their customers were Americans or people in Ontario who got around it through a bit of fancy paperwork. If you were in Toronto and you wanted to buy Goodrum and Warts whiskey, you weren't allowed to just go to Goodrum and Warts and buy it. But if you could get a receipt from the Goodrum and Warts office in Montreal that proved you bought it from Quebec, technically, you could then go to the Goodrum and Warts warehouse in Toronto with that receipt, pick up your booze, and take it home to drink, though you'd have to take it straight home. You weren't even allowed to deviate from your route to go check your mail. That would be illegal. And these loopholes meant that lots of bootleggers were able to get a hold of Canadian and Ontario booze and pretend that they were selling it to the Americans. Even once the United States had prohibition, the Ontario government wouldn't keep you from selling to Americans, even though it was illegal as far as the Americans were concerned. So people like Goodrum and Warts could still be selling booze and become giant bootlegging empires of their own. And people like Rocco Perry took advantage by buying huge amounts of booze from Ontario distillers and brewers, loading their ships filled with it with a bit of fake paperwork that said they had a customer in the United States. Then they take their boat out into Lake Ontario, wait for it to get dark, and then turn around and come back into Toronto so that all that booze could be secretly bootlegged into those speakeasies and blind pigs. Eventually, Rocco and Bessie had a fleet of something like 50 boats, and their territory extended all over sort of this part of the Great Lakes. Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, Southern Ontario, upstate New York, the Niagara River was all part of their empire, with a fleet of mostly ordinary fishermen who were perfectly happy to make a little money on the side, breaking a law they didn't believe in anyway. Though in time, those fleets would get reinforced and grow, and the bootlegging empires would become ever more deadly. Eventually, there'd be fleets of armored boats on Lake Ontario as well. And Rocco Perry did lots of this pretty much out in the open. As I say, he was pretending to be a macaroni salesman, but at one point he even gave an interview to the Toronto Star declaring that he was a bootlegger, that he wasn't ashamed to admit it, and that a bootlegger he would remain. So Rocco and Bessie were making an absolute fortune off it, and the police didn't seem like they could stop them. He compared dealing with them to dealing with schoolboys learning to play ball, leaving the Toronto police desperate for victories. Now, the landscape of booze in Toronto was shifting during this period too. The Goodrum and Warts Distillery is a great example of it. This huge complex that made more whiskey than any other place on earth, that had been owned and founded by the Goodrum and Warts families, but whose descendants decided to get out of the business during this period because they didn't want to have to deal with these bootleggers, which is where all the money was waiting to be made. So the descendants of the Goodrum family ended up selling the distillery to someone who had fewer compunctions about dealing with these members of the criminal underworld. This guy, Harry Hatch, he'd get on his start with a single liquor store in Prince Edward County, but would grow it into one of the biggest, I think, booze empires probably in the world. He'd own the Corby Distillery, the Goodrum and Warts Distillery, eventually Hiram Walker too, just an absolute force. And a lot of the fortune he was making was off dealing with bootleggers. The distillery's biggest customer became Rocco Perry, who would load those boats up, head them off into the lake, wait for darkness, and bring them back. But sometimes things could turn tragic. At one point, Bessie Starkman placed a huge order with Hatch's distillery in Belleville, that Corby distillery I mentioned. Just an enormous amount of whiskey that was loaded up into this boat here, the Hattie C. 2,500 plus bottles of whiskey loaded into this little boat. It was resting really low in the water as it puttered off from the distillery in Belleville out into Lake Ontario, and then did what the bootleggers tended to do, which was to wait. In fact, they waited for the most darkness they could get. They spent days sort of slowly making their way through Lake Ontario until the end of that week, by which point the moon had gotten thinner and thinner until by the Friday night, it was just a little sliver. And when it passed behind some clouds, they seized the opportunity in the darkness to try to unload their booze at Ashbridges Bay. But even then in the darkness, someone must have seen them, because the police station at Pape got a call that some bootleggers had been seen unloading booze at the foot of, I think, Leslie Street. And the police, desperate for a victory, raced down to Ashbridges Bay, where they found Rocco Perry himself and a group of his bootleggers leaping into the bushes to try to evade arrest as they arrived. The Hattie C had a crew of 4 men, just an ordinary fisherman, I think his son, his brother, and a family friend. And when the police arrived, they tried to make a run for it. They turned the engine on and started puttering back out into Lake Ontario, which is when the police called out for them to stop, probably weren't heard over the sound of the engine, and then pulled out their guns. Rocco Perry, who'd been caught in the bushes, shouted out for them to not open fire, that there were men on board, that the bullets wouldn't stop the boat anyway, which the police later admitted, but that didn't stop them. They opened fire anyway, fired 15, maybe even 30 bullets into that boat, tearing through it, doing nothing to slow it down, but deeply wounding the men on board. It was a grisly, bloody scene. One of the men had to be rushed to have emergency surgery at St. Michael's Hospital. Another one bled to death right there on the scene over the course of the next 15 minutes. And so it became a huge scandal. But when the time for a trial came, the people who were in the most trouble weren't the bootleggers, but the police officers who'd opened fire. They admitted they weren't going to stop the boat by doing it, and that if it were a truck instead of a boat, they never would have done it. And so they were put on trial for manslaughter. The first jury couldn't agree on a verdict. They had a second trial, and that jury couldn't agree either. So in the end, the police weren't convicted of anything, but it was a deep embarrassment for the Toronto police force that not only had they been unable to stop many of Toronto's bootleggers, but the one time they did, things had turned deadly. During this era, the government kept trying to crack down more and more, and eventually decided they needed to make it illegal to produce any drinkable alcohol at all. And so we brought in laws saying that the only alcohol that could be created in the province of Ontario would be undrinkable, like industrial grade alcohol. And the bootleggers like Rocco Perry responded by hiring chemists to take that industrial alcohol and make it drinkable again. And this was an incredibly dangerous process that ended up turning deeply deadly. Rocco Perry had a bunch of chemists on his payroll. And one day, one of them got a call while he was out at a party. He'd been batching or working on a batch of booze at, I think, a perfume factory was their front in New York State. Got a call from one of Perry's bootleggers who was there at the factory ready to pick up an order and was probably pretty desperate to get it and put it into the speakeasies and blind pigs and really wanted to take it with him. But the chemist said he wasn't sure if it was done. The bootlegger pushed him and pushed him. The chemist eventually told him that he could go look for himself. And if the alcohol was still cloudy, that would mean that it wasn't ready to go. But if it was clear, the process was done, it was safe to drink, and he could take it. And this bootlegger, who was probably desperate to take it with him and not to disappoint a murderous figure like Rocco Perry, well, he had a lot of incentive to see that it was clear. When the chemist returned to the factory later, he discovered with horror that it wasn't clear at all. It was still incredibly cloudy. He said it was too dangerous to touch, never mind to drink. But by then it was too late. What became known as this bunk hooch had already been sent into speakeasies and blind pigs across southern Ontario and upstate New York, and people soon began dying horrifying deaths from that poisoning. One woman was foaming blood at the mouth, at least one customer. Someone else turned blue. Another was vomiting black bile. Another stood by her kitchen windows looking into her backyard and wondered why the leaves on all the trees were going black. It's because she was going blind from the poisoning. In the end, something like 40 plus people ended up dying these horrifying deaths from this poisoned alcohol. thanks to this Rocco Perry shipment. And it's part of why Prohibition ended up coming to an end in Ontario. There was a new provincial election soon, and some started thinking that Prohibition was actually deadlier than allowing legal drinking had to be. And so that's how we got the new era of drinking in Ontario. After that next election, Prohibition was repealed, and we got the LCBO instead. Very much still set up to control drinking. It's the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, after all. For decades, people would have to have licenses to buy booze at the LCBO. You'd have to have a little book like this one, which I'm sure some of you remember, where the salespeople would keep track of everything you were buying so they could cut you off if they felt like you were drinking too much. The government even had official lists of what they called interdiction lists of official drunkards who were banned from buying booze altogether. And you can thank sort of Rocco Perry's bunk hooch for this new era that we're still in a lot of ways today. As for Rocco Perry and Bessie Starkman, well, they would both come to potentially grisly ends, which is the last thing I'll tell you about today before we go. One day, when Rocco Perry and Bessie Starkman came back from playing cards at her sister's place, they found some men waiting for them in the driveway of their Hamilton home, and those men opened fire on them when they arrived. This is a photo of the blood-stained crime scene. Bessie Starkman was shot dead by those men carrying, I believe, shotguns. Her funeral would be a huge public event. Not sure why one person's been cut out of it. You could see the big crowd that came, both to gawk, some to pay their respects. Rocco Perry was there, of course, and was seen to be deeply bereft, but some still wonder to this day whether he's actually the one who orchestrated the hit and had his partner murdered so he could take on their crime empire alone. He, though, would also come to, let's say, a mysterious end. In the wake of Bessie Starkman's death, he got a new woman, a mistress, who ended up buying the Metro Theater in what's now Koreatown. It's still there today. I think it's maybe a gym now. And she was actually using it as the front for a big gold smuggling operation. She had miners and assayers from Ontario mines on her payroll. Gold miners would pocket some flakes. The assayers would weigh the gold inaccurately and then pocket the difference, give it to her to be melted down into gold bars that then she had smugglers cross the border with under their clothes. It all came crashing to the ground when one of those smugglers was discovered trying to get into the United States. But by then, Rocco Perry was in jail. It only ever happened twice to him in his entire life. The first time was when he was convicted for perjury, for having lied during a trial over the Goodrum and Mort's distillery when they were accused of tax evasion. The second time was during the Second World War. The Toronto police kept a list of Italian Canadians they thought had ties to organized crime, to the mob, to the mafia, but who they couldn't get enough evidence against to prove the charges, to get them to stick. And as soon as war was declared between Canada and Italy, within hours, the Toronto police were rounding up Italian Canadians under the War Measures Act, throwing them in prisons, one of them being Rocco Perry. So he was one of the first rounded up and then one of the last released. And when he was, he found that his empire had crumbled. He worked at the Metro Theater for a while, pretending, I guess, to be a janitor, while he surveyed what was left of his prospects. A big gangster from Buffalo had muscled in on his territory, had seized a lot of the bootlegging operations here, and Rocco Perry seemed to want some of that back. It was during a trip to Hamilton to visit his old house he had shared with Bessie Starkman that he put on his coat and his fedora, said he was going out for a walk, and then was never seen again. Some think that he knew that his time was up, that this Buffalo gangster had his number, that he no longer had the resources he needed to fight back, that it was only a matter of time until he'd be killed. And so he slipped across the border into the United States and kept going all the way to Mexico, where he lived the rest of his life under some made-up name. Others think that that Buffalo gangster got him, that on that walk, some of those gangsters pulled up to him in a car and shoved him inside, drove him down to the Hamilton waterfront, stuffed him inside a barrel of cement, and sank him to the bottom of Hamilton Harbor, so that if you're looking for the king of the bootleggers today, you'll find him beneath the waters of Lake Ontario, where he's been resting for more than, or nearly, 100 years. So those are just some of the stories of the most notorious bootleggers and smugglers in Toronto history. I'm sure there are many more beyond that, but I had some great fun getting to dive into that history. So thank you all so much for tuning in and for listening to it all. Since this is the last talk in this series, I'll mention too that if you're looking for more of my work, I've got 2 books of Toronto history, the Toronto Book of the Dead and the Toronto Book of Love, that's filled with stories about duels and executions and hangings on one side, romance and heartbreak and scandalous love affairs on the other, some stories which we'll be talking about in the fall here as well. As Sergio mentioned, I've got my Toronto Time Traveler newsletter, which you can subscribe to for free if you like. I try to put it out every week or two, stories about Toronto history that I write, but also local heritage news and event listings as well. And a place where I plug all the things I'm up to. So if you want to know what I'm up to next, what my upcoming talks and tours are, that's the best place to follow along. Sergio mentioned I'm also the host and co-creator of a Canadian history documentary series, Canadiana, which is all free to watch on YouTube. We've traveled across the country looking for the most incredible stories we can find. And you'll find everything I'm up to and links to all of that on my website, which is just myname.com. So hopefully some of you are interested in checking some more of that out. And in the fall, as Sergio mentioned, we're going to do another series of talks, a lot like this, but instead of Toronto's most notorious, we're going to do Toronto's most scandalous. The first one is going to be Toronto's most scandalous love affairs. It's happening Friday, September 12th, same format as this. It'll be the first of 4 talks that we're going to do through the last 4 months of 2025. So hopefully some of you will be able to tune in for those as well. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for tuning in. I believe we'll go through the Q&A, but I also will at this point turn it back over to Sergio for that. Thank you, everyone.